Hello everyone, welcome to the part 8 of Active Directory Certificate Services attack series. And in this video we'll look into ESC8, which involves relaying either NTLM or it could be Kerberos in case the environment is hardened, authentication to certificate services web enrollment endpoint. First we'll talk about NTLM relaying, which is very common because most environments nowadays still have NTLM enabled because of backwards compatibility. You don't want to break stuff, which makes sense. And then I'll demonstrate how can relay Kerberos as well in case the environment has been hardened and NTLM is disabled on the domain. And lastly, as always, we'll talk about mitigations, what we can do to prevent this type of attack, and I'll show you exactly what to do. Alright, let's dive in. So first, let's, as always, go to Certify Wiki and look into privilege escalation methods, and we're gonna scroll down to ESC8, which is, as I mentioned, is NTLM relay to ADCS Web Enrollment, but there's also a way to relay Kerberos. That research came out, I think, late last year, which I'll show you a bit later. So basically, if we read this, what makes it vulnerable is that by default, Web Enrollment endpoint accepts NTLM authentication and it lacks NTLM protection. Basically, there's no external protection for authentication, which is EPA. This is kind of what signs the requests. This has been off by default up until server 2025. So starting from server 2025, it's actually on by default, but some companies might turn it off. Who knows? So something always worth checking. And the attack processes, which I'll demonstrate, but we'll quickly walk through it, is requires authentication. Basically, we need to find a way to force NTLM authentication or RPC. Usually you can use something like pitted bottom or printer bug or some other coercion mechanism that you can enumerate, or you can also coerce users. Basically, if you drop something like a .lnk file on a share, somebody views it, they'll send you their NTLM hash and you can relay it as well, which we'll talk a bit more about it later. So yes, I can start with step our NTLM relay. We can either use certifies relay command or we can use NTLM relay X. Doesn't really matter. And then we just specify where we're relaying to, which is this is the default certificate web enrollment, certificate services web enrollment endpoint to usually relay to. Then we impersonate the user. We're gonna get the certificate and we're gonna authenticate the certificate and get their NT hash that we can use to do whatever as the user. So let's dive in. As always, first we'll run certify find command to make sure, just basically to see if there are any vulnerabilities. I already have it right here. I got my find dash vulnerable to find all vulnerable templates, our username, our password, the main controller IP, and we're gonna just print it out to standard out. And I'm gonna click enter. And as we can see, we have ESC8 vulnerability because web enrollment is enabled or HTTPS and channel binding is disabled, which we can see right here. Channel binding EPA is false. There's another tool you can use to enumerate this, but you still need credentials, but it's called NTLM Informer, I think it is. This just really came out from Spectre Ops, which very good. You can enumerate basically anything like HTTP, MSSQL, or LDAP. So you can go here. It has all the instructions to install it, and I think it's very good. You can scan. Usually companies got better at enabling SMB sign-in, but LDAP and MSSQL and HTTP are still, lots of administrators don't know about it. That's an issue, but you can scan for it using this tool. Just thought I would mention it. So yeah, now we know that's vulnerable, and next we should test our DC. So in our case, we're gonna relay DC because I have two separate servers. We got our domain controller, and I got my Active Directory Certificate Services server, which is a separate server. Oops, my VMware is going crazy. So I'm gonna curse DC this machine to authenticate back to us, and from here we'll relate to Active Directory certificate services. So first we want to make sure we can curse DC, the main controller, and for that we're gonna use not exact. There's this curse plus plugin which is gonna identify all the possible coercion methods. This is very useful. We can run across every single IP just to see what servers or endpoints you can coerce. This is very good. So be here. I was doing some testing, so I'll just remove it real quick. So yeah, this is my DC. I'm gonna run curse plus, and we can see it's vulnerable to all these methods: DFS cursor, repeated pattern, printer bug, and MS even. So we know for sure we can curse hide ADCS, so now we just have to stop the NTLM relay. And if we go back to certify wiki, we can see it in here. It's very simple. We just specify certify, relay, target, and we give it template. In our case, we're gonna relay the domain controller, so we're gonna specify the main controller template. But if you're relaying a user, you'd have to specify a user template. Here's my command. So specify relay dash target, which is gonna be our ADCS endpoint. It's gonna be this server, Gotham ADCS, and we specify the template, and we just click enter, and it's gonna set up a relay. So now, as you can see, it's gonna relate it as Web Enrollment endpoint, and now we just have to curse our domain controller to authenticate to us. And we're gonna use not exact for this because it's easier and has all the methods. It's very similar, just specify the target we want to authenticate against. We specify cars plus and our listener, which is our IP that we're listening on, because we have our relay set up on our IP. It's listening on all IPs, but so in my case it's 75.156. So when I click run, it's gonna curse authentication from the main controller. Oh yeah, it all worked. I was like, too many messages. What's going on? So yeah, the moment I hit run, it's like, hey, I received an authentication from the main controller, which is 132, and it relayed that authentication to the ADCS as hide RDC, and now it's submitted certificate request as hide RDC based on the template, and it got a certificate. So basically here, we got a certificate for hide RDC, which is the main controller, which we can actually use to do a DC sync attack. So it's basically one step to the main admin from a regular user, which is very interesting. Very cool attack. So now we can see we got our certificate. Now we just have to get NTLM hash for the DC. That will use certify auth, and we need to specify DC IP. And we got the hash for the domain controller that we can use to do a DC sync using impacket, something like secrets dump. Oh, that's something wrong. Local there's DC $sign at to give the IP. That's just the packet command to do DC sync. So I'll demonstrate to you that we got from regular user to the main admin in seconds. As you can see, now we got all the hashes. So that was NTLM relay. Hope you enjoyed it. But now let's look into Kerberos relay, which is even more fun. So let me remove all this stuff. Very good. So this research came out from synaktiv. When was it? So yeah, late 2024, which is very cool. And talks about how we can actually like Kerberos over SMB to ADCS. So NTLM relay, oh sorry. Certify only talks about NTLM, but now we can actually do Kerberos as well. So if you're not familiar with Kerberos relay, it's basically theoretical way of explaining it. So we just somebody authenticates against DC, they create an API request, which is basically being sent to us because we carry some client to authenticate to us, and we actually relay API to our target. But the problem with Kerberos is that it has to be the same, so you need to make your client to actually authenticate to servers that has the same name. Only then you can relay it. Don't think I'm explaining it really well. I'll link it in the video below so you could take it for yourself and it will make more sense, but I'll also show you the commands and it will make more sense. So yeah, and the trick here is that you have to create this specific marshaled DNS record, which looks like this, like super weird. And how it works is we can set a fake DNS entry for any ADCS host that hosts ADCS Web Enrollment certificate. So we basically create, like in my case, it's Gotham. We would make it Gotham and this weird DNS entry. And this later gets stripped, and the actual domain controller sends an authentication to the list part to the FQDN. I think they show it here. So for that, we are gonna use Kerberos X. And here it's kind of how it looks like. Basically, we have their host name is called PKI4, looks like. And they specify the IP of their target, of their machine that they'll be listening on. And just a screenshot from Wireshark, which it's just they show that there's already functionality to relay Kerberos, which is not that interesting. But yeah, then they set up Kerberos X to relay Kerberos authentication to the domain controller. And out, it's a little bit confusing. It just I don't think I'm explaining well, but now we're gonna go into the attack and it will hopefully make more sense. It didn't make sense to me first time I was reading this. It was probably late last year as well when it came out. There was a hack the box machine that was demonstrating this, which was kind of confusing to me, but we're gonna do the attack and hopefully it will make more sense. Essentially, we're gonna create this DNS record. It's gonna be our machine Gotham and this weird DNS. It's gonna strip it, like this is gonna get removed, and it's gonna send the authentication to just Gotham. But because this DNS has our IP address, authentication will actually go to us, our IP. But the actual Kerberos servers is gonna be just Gotham. So that's kind of why it's gonna work, because it sends the actual ticket for the servers, which we're relaying to, and that makes Kerberos work. And then we're gonna request the certificate using the permissions of our relayed target. Yeah, let's dive in. I don't want to confuse you anymore. So first, always, as it was in the blog, we have to add this special DNS record, and it just has to be the name of the actual ADCS endpoint. So in my case, it's Gotham, so I have to add Gotham. If in your case, your ADCS endpoint is called, I don't know, fake ADCS, you do that. It just has to be whatever the host name of your Active Directory Certificate Services server is, where the web enrollment endpoint is located. It's here at Gotham, and the string has to look like this. It's actually defined by RFC, I think. So here we just give it our username, our password, the actual fake record we want to add, and it's gonna be our IP that we want to put in as data. And it's actually any user can add DNS records in the main environment, so anyone can do this. A specify action modify, because I already have it, you would have to do something like add to edit. I'll leave it as modify. Next, to specify our target, which is hide.dc, and --tcp, and DNS, which is the DNS location. That's just to make it work. Alright, so I'm gonna hit enter. It's gonna be okay, a modified record. And now this record actually goes back to our IP. So now we can set up the attack. So our Kerberos X would look like this, the command itself. So you have to pull this whole repo. This has a DNS tool, ADCS, and Kerberos X. This from Darkjan. I think I showed you this tools in one of the previous videos. I think it was for unconstrained delegation. So here we specify our target, which is going to be the ADCS endpoint. Make sure it's all domain names, no IPs, because we're dealing with Kerberos. Need to specify ADCS to make sure it's aligned to ADCS. We need to give it the template name, and we need to give it our target, which in our case is going to be hide.dc. Also make sure your Packet tool is latest version, because it might not work with Packet version 12 or 11. I think it has to be at least 13 something to make for it to work. So we're gonna start our listener, and this is gonna relay whatever comes to our IP to the ADCS endpoint. Alright, so let's start it. And now we're basically gonna do the same thing, which we're gonna Kerberos authentication. But now instead of IP, we have to specify the listener, which is going to be Gotham, basically the DNS record we just created. And when we hit enter, it's going to Kerberos authentication back to our IP. So let's hit enter. And let's look at Kerberos output. So here you can see we gather an authentication from the DC, and we create a CSR, and we create a certificate, and we request a certificate for hide.dc. So now we relate Kerberos instead of NTLM to basically do the same attack and to get the hide.dc certificate. And now again we can do, you can see it even looks a bit different. Now again we can do get the actual hash and do a DC sync again, which I'll just show you real quick one more time. It's gonna be a different certificate. And we got the same hash, and as you saw before, we can do DC sync again. So that was it. Again, I'll link this article in the description below to make sure it makes more sense to you guys, in case I didn't explain something well. But it's a really good read, and yeah, it's also possible to relay Kerberos sometimes. Alright, now let's go back to the mitigation. As I mentioned before, to prevent this attack, then we have to enable this EPA, which is, I always forget what it stands for. But it basically assigns your sessions to make sure they cannot be replayed. Log in. So here's how you can do it. Again, on servers 2025, it's enabled by default, but sometimes people may disable it. So here you just go to IIS Manager and you find your certain survey, and then you go to authentication. And it's not only for web enrollment, it's for any kind of website to have. Ideally, you should enable it. So when you go to Windows authentication, advanced settings, and you change XM protection to required. You save it, and I think you need to restart IIS reset. And now if we try to do relay, we can see that it's going to fail. So I'll do basic NTLM one, just to save us some time. and Carson. And it's gonna scroll up. And we can see got authorization support response from ADCS authentication against web enrollment failed. That's because the session was expecting a signature and we didn't have a valid one, so it failed. Alright, that was it for this video. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.